If you wanted to find the most insufferably brilliant minds in the known universe, you'd head straight to the Galactic Mathematics Consortium. Not because you enjoyed having your intellectual inadequacy rubbed in your face, mind you, but because that's where the real action was. This wasn't some dusty university basement with cobwebs and theories scribbled on chalkboards. No, this was a space station the size of a small moon, orbiting a neutron star, where hundreds of alien species gathered to tackle mathematical problems that would make your average genius weep into their morning beverage. The station itself was a marvel. Crystalline spires jutting from a central sphere, each section color-coded by department, with observation decks that offered a view of space-time literally bending around the neutron star below. Pretty, sure. Terrifying? Absolutely. The kind of place where you could calculate the exact moment the universe might end while sipping something that passed for tea. On this particular morning, the Grand Assembly Hall was packed. And when I say packed, I mean wall-to-wall brilliance. Tentacles, wings, exoskeletons, energy forms that barely held cohesion. You name it, it was there. All eyes, stalks, sensors, and whatever passed for visual organs were fixed on the central platform where Nalrith stood in all their glory. Nalrith was Quarren, a species that looked like someone had taken an octopus, given it iridescent purple skin, added about 6 more limbs, and decided that bioluminescent patterns would be a nice touch. Their species had a reputation that preceded them across star systems, mathematical prodigies, every single one. They could calculate hyperspace trajectories in their sleep. Their children solved differential equations for fun. And Nalrith? Nalrith was the best of the best. Esteemed colleagues, Nalrith's voice resonated through the hall, translated instantly into hundreds of languages by the station's systems. I stand before you to present the conclusive proof that the dimensional cascade paradox cannot, will not, and shall never be solved. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some impressed, some disappointed, but nobody surprised. The dimensional cascade paradox had been the white whale of mathematics for 300 cycles. Brilliant minds had thrown themselves at this equation like moths at a flame, and every single one had crashed and burned. The paradox dealt with the intersection of dimensional mathematics and quantum field manipulation, basically the key to revolutionizing faster-than-light travel and energy generation. Solve it, and you'd reshape civilization. Fail, and you'd join the long, prestigious list of failures. Nalrith's presentation lasted 4 hours. 4 hours. The holographic displays showed mathematical notation so complex it looked like abstract art. Proofs built on proofs, theorems referencing theorems, all leading to one inevitable conclusion. Impossible. As you can observe, Nalrith continued, one tentacle pointing at a particularly dense cluster of symbols. The recursive dimensional folding creates an infinite regression that collapses any attempt at resolution. We have approached this from every conceivable angle across multiple mathematical frameworks. The conclusion is inescapable. In the back of the hall, in a seat so far from the action that it might as well have been in another zip code, sat Liana. Liana was human. This was immediately obvious to anyone with functioning sensory organs because humans were, well, let's just say, they weren't known for their mathematical prowess on the galactic stage. Sure, they'd figured out space travel, built some decent computers, and had a few neat tricks up their sleeves. But compared to species that had been doing mathematics since before Earth's continents had finished drifting into place, humans were basically adorable children with calculators. Liana had arrived at the consortium 3 weeks ago as part of Earth's exchange program. a diplomatic gesture that was more about goodwill than any expectation of actual contribution. She'd been assigned an office in Section 19C, which was the station's polite way of saying, "That weird corner where we put things we don't know what to do with." No window, flickering light panel, the recycling system that made odd gurgling sounds at random intervals. She didn't particularly care. At 29 cycles old, years, humans still used years, Liana had been something of a prodigy back on Earth. Youngest person to solve the Reinhardt conjecture. Tenured position at MIT before 30. The works. But here she was, basically the mathematical equivalent of a houseplant. Decorative, possibly producing oxygen, but not expected to do much else. She'd spent her first week trying to decipher alien mathematical notation, her second week wondering if the cafeteria food would eventually kill her, her third week coming to terms with the fact that she was probably going to spend the next 2 years being politely ignored by beings who could calculate things she couldn't even conceptualize. Now, sitting in that back row, Liana was fighting to stay awake. Not because Nalrith wasn't brilliant. They absolutely were. The proof was airtight, elegant even, in that way that made you want to weep at its beauty, while simultaneously feeling crushingly inadequate. But 4 hours of dense mathematical exposition delivered in a voice that never wavered in its confident monotone, that was a special kind of torture. Liana's mind wandered. She thought about the sandwich she'd grab after this, wondered if her sister had responded to her last message from Earth, started mentally calculating how many more sessions like this she'd have to endure before her assignment was up. Then Nalrith said something that snagged her attention. The fundamental barrier exists in the assumption of continuous dimensional threading. All previous attempts have failed because they maintain this framework. Liana frowned. She raised her hand. The gesture was so unexpected that it took a moment for anyone to notice. Humans didn't typically interrupt presentations at the consortium, mostly because they didn't understand enough to have questions worth asking. Nalrith's bioluminescent patterns flickered, the Quarren equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Yes? The human delegate has a query? All sensors, eyes, and stalks swiveled toward Liana. She could feel the weight of all that genius-level attention, and part of her brain screamed to sit back down and shut up. But the larger part, the part that had gotten her into trouble her entire life, pushed forward. "Why continuous?" she asked, her voice clear despite the distance. Silence. "I'm sorry?" Nalrith's patterns pulsed confusion. "Why does it have to be continuous dimensional threading? What if it's not? What if the assumption itself is the problem?" The silence stretched. Then, somewhere in the middle rows, someone made a sound that the translator interpreted as polite laughter. Nalrith's patterns shifted to something almost patient, the way you might look at a child who'd just asked why the sky couldn't be purple. "My dear colleague," Nalrith said, and the condescension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Dimensional threading must be continuous, because dimensionality itself is fundamentally continuous. This is not assumption. This is mathematical law established over millennia of research across countless frameworks. To suggest otherwise demonstrates a misunderstanding of the basic principles involved." More laughter. Gentle, not cruel, but definitely amused. Liana felt her face flush. "Right, of course. Sorry." She sank back into her seat, and the presentation continued. But something itched at the back of her mind. Something about Nalrith's dismissal. Something about the way everyone had simply accepted that continuity was essential. The presentation concluded to thunderous approval, or whatever the multi-species equivalent was. Appendages were waved, sounds were made, Energy fields pulsed in appreciation. Nalrith basked in it, patterns glowing with satisfaction. The consortium's High Council, a group of the most distinguished mathematicians representing the major civilizations, convened on stage. There was Morphan, the crystalline being from Sector 9, whose species processed mathematics through quantum entanglement. Beside them stood Quilnax, whose gaseous form shifted colors as they thought. Three others, whose names Liana hadn't quite mastered yet. Nalrith, Morphan's voice chimed like struck glass. Your proof is magnificent. The Council formally accepts your conclusion. The dimensional cascade paradox shall be classified as proven unsolvable. This closes a 300-cycle chapter in mathematical history. Applause again. Nalrith practically glowed. Liana gathered her things and slipped out before the formal reception could begin. She had no interest in standing around making small talk with beings who thought she was adorable at best, irrelevant at worst. The corridors of the consortium were quieter, the walls lined with holographic displays showing famous equations and their solvers. She passed the Vornak's theorem, solved 200 cycles ago, the quantum binding principle, cracked by a team of Ixtar researchers. Each one a triumph, each solver's name immortalized. Her stomach growled. Right. Food. The most relatable problem in the universe. Section 19C was a long walk from the Grand Assembly Hall. Of course it was. By the time Liana reached her office, her feet hurt, and her brain felt like it had been through a mathematical blender. She grabbed her datapad, locked up, and headed toward the cafeteria. The station's food service tried its best to accommodate hundreds of species with wildly different nutritional needs and preferences. For humans, this meant a corner station that dispensed things that were technically edible and vaguely resembled Earth food if you squinted and didn't think too hard about it. Liana ordered something the menu claimed was a sandwich and a cup of coffee that smelled almost right. She paid with her station credit chip and found a small table near the viewport. Outside, the neutron star spun, distorting the star field around it. Beautiful and deadly, like most things in space. She was halfway through her sandwich when a familiar face appeared. Mind if I join you? Or are you busy solving the mysteries of the universe? Oren dropped into the seat across from her without waiting for an answer. He was the other human on the station, an engineer assigned to maintain the fusion relays in sections 8 through 12. They'd bonded over their shared status as the station's token representatives from Earth, and over their mutual appreciation for sarcasm. Just solve them all, Liana said, not looking up. Turned out the answer was 42. Who knew? Shocking. How was the big presentation? Long, brilliant, soul-crushing, the usual. Oren unwrapped his own meal, something that might have been pasta in a previous life. Let me guess. Nalrith proved something was impossible. Everyone applauded, and you're questioning your life choices. Nailed it. They ate in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside the viewport, a transport ship glided past, its lights blinking in a pattern that probably meant something to someone. I asked a stupid question, Liana said finally. How stupid are we talking? Why is space dark stupid? Or, what if we just turned it off and on again stupid? I questioned whether dimensional threading had to be continuous. Oren paused mid-bite. In front of everyone? Yep. And they laughed politely. Nalrith explained to me like I was 5 that dimensionality is fundamentally continuous, and my question revealed a basic misunderstanding of principles established over millennia. Ouch. Yeah. Oren studied her. But you still think you're onto something. It wasn't a question. He knew her well enough by now. Liana shrugged, pulling out her datapad. Probably not. I'm probably completely wrong, and they're completely right, and I should just shut up and learn from my betters. But it bugs me. The way Nalrith dismissed it so quickly. The way everyone just accepts it as fundamental truth. She started pulling up notes. Half-eaten sandwich forgotten. Look, I get that I'm out of my depth here. These beings have been doing mathematics since before humans figured out fire. But sometimes, when everyone agrees on something, when nobody even questions it anymore, that's when the assumption becomes invisible. Deep thoughts for lunch. I contain multitudes. She was scrolling through the dimensional cascade paradox now, the notation flowing across her screen. You ever notice how alien mathematics is really thorough? Like almost too thorough? I design fusion relays. My math is mostly don't let this explode level. Right, but that's practical math, applied math. You're looking for solutions, not proofs. These guys? She gestured vaguely at the station around them. They're so focused on elegance, on proving why things work or don't work, that sometimes I think they miss the obvious. Oren chewed thoughtfully. The obvious being? I don't know yet. That's the annoying part. She pulled out a napkin. Actual paper, one of the small comforts the cafeteria provided for species that liked physical writing surfaces, and started sketching. Just doodling, really. Numbers and symbols, letting her mind wander around the problem without trying to force anything. This was how Liana had always worked best, not with rigid proofs and formal structures, but with intuition and play. Her professors at MIT had found it frustrating. Her papers had gotten published despite raising eyebrows because, somehow, her messy approach yielded results. She called it lazy mathematics, finding the path of least resistance rather than the most rigorous one. You're doing the thing, Oren observed. What thing? The thing where you say you're just doodling, but you're actually working through something, and in about 10 minutes, you'll either have a breakthrough or decide you need more coffee. I resent that accurate assessment of my process. But he was right. Her hand was moving faster now, filling the napkin with notation. Human notation, not the elaborate alien systems. Simple algebra, basic calculus, the tools she'd grown up with. What if dimensional threading wasn't continuous? What would that even look like? She grabbed another napkin. Okay, so Nalrith's entire proof rests on the assumption that you can't have discrete dimensional steps without causing cascading paradoxes, right? Because if dimensions are continuous, then any attempt to manipulate them creates this infinite regression problem. Sure, yes, words I definitely understand, Oren said. But what if, and hear me out, what if you don't try to manipulate continuous dimensions at all? What if you treat the whole thing like a jump cut instead of a fade? I genuinely have no idea what you're talking about. Liana wasn't really talking to him anymore. Her eyes had that distant look they got when she was working through something. More napkins appeared. Numbers flowed. It's like, okay, in film editing, right? You can do a smooth transition between scenes, or you can just cut. Just jump from one frame to another. And yeah, it's discontinuous, but it works because human perception fills in the gap. What if dimensional mathematics works the same way? What if you don't need continuous threading because the universe itself doesn't actually process dimensionality continuously? She was writing faster now, coffee forgotten, sandwich abandoned. Oren watched with a mixture of fascination and concern. This was either going somewhere brilliant or nowhere at all, and with Liana, it was honestly 50-50. The paradox appears because they're trying to maintain continuous threading during dimensional cascade. But if you allow discrete jumps, If you build in intentional discontinuity as a feature rather than a bug, her hand flew across the napkins. Oh, 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 oh. That's not ominous at all. Leanna looked up, and there was something wild in her eyes. Oren, I think I just solved it. Solved what? The dimensional cascade paradox. He blinked. The one that just got declared unsolvable by the smartest beings in the galaxy? That's the one. The one that's been stumping mathematicians for 300 years? Yep. And you solved it. On napkins. During lunch. I know how it sounds. Oren stared at her, then at the napkins scattered across their table, then back at her. You're serious? I think so. I mean, I'd need to run the full calculations, but the framework is there. It works. The discrete dimensional jumping approach bypasses the infinite regression entirely because there's nothing to regress through. You're not trying to maintain continuity. You're explicitly breaking it in controlled intervals. Leanna. Yeah? Do you have any idea what kind of chaos you're about to unleash? She looked down at her napkins, at the scribbled equations that had poured out of her in less than 30 minutes, at the solution to a problem that the galaxy's best minds had declared impossible just hours ago. A slow grin spread across her face. Yeah, I think I do. The thing about submitting a mathematical proof that contradicts the galaxy's leading experts is that there's a process, forms to fill out, digital signatures, a peer review queue that typically took weeks, sometimes months. The consortium didn't rush brilliance, or, in this case, what would probably turn out to be spectacular human hubris. Leanna filled out the submission form that evening in her cramped office, the gurgling recycling system providing ambiance. She attached scans of her napkins. Yes, napkins, along with a more formal write-up she'd spent 3 hours composing. Then she hit submit and tried not to think about the professional humiliation that would follow when the review board tore her work apart. Oren had offered to proofread it. She'd declined. Either it was right, or it wasn't. Having a witness to her failure seemed unnecessary. 3 days passed. Leanna went about her routine, attending lectures she barely understood, working through basic consortium training modules, avoiding eye contact with mathematicians who probably didn't remember she existed. The neutron star kept spinning. The station kept orbiting. Life continued in its vast, indifferent way. On the morning of the 4th day, her data pad exploded with notifications. Not literally. That would come later, metaphorically speaking, but the sheer volume of alerts made her fumble the device and nearly drop it into her morning coffee substitute. Messages, urgent tags, priority flags. Her submission had been flagged for immediate High Council review. That was not normal. Her door chimed. Before she could respond, it slid open to reveal a being she'd seen exactly once before, from a distance. Plixon. Plixon was Ithrix, an insectoid species with chitinous plating that shimmered between copper and green, depending on the light. 6 limbs, compound eyes, mandibles that clicked when they were thinking. They held the rank of Associate Research Coordinator, middle management in the consortium's hierarchy, the beings who did the actual work, while the luminaries took the credit. Leanna? Plixon's voice came through the translator with a faint buzzing undertone. That's me. Is something wrong? Wrong. Plixon's mandibles clicked rapidly. Wrong. May I enter? Sure? Plixon scuttled inside, the door sliding shut behind them. They stood there, antennae twitching, and Leanna realized with some surprise that the alien seemed nervous. I was assigned to preliminary review of your submission, Plixon said finally. Standard procedure. Most submissions to the open queue are Well, they're either redundant or fundamentally flawed. I was going to spend maybe 10 minutes on it, file a polite rejection, move on. But I started reading, and I couldn't stop. And then I ran your framework through the verification protocols, and then I ran them again. And then I triple-checked my work because surely I'd made an error, and Plixen's antennae drooped. And it works. Your solution works. The office suddenly felt very small. It does? It does. The discrete dimensional jumping approach eliminates the infinite regression. It's elegant. It's simple. It's completely counter to 300 cycles of established mathematical doctrine. And it works. Plixen's mandibles clicked faster. I brought it to my supervisor, who brought it to their supervisor, who convened an emergency verification team. Lyanna, the High Council is reviewing your work right now, along with Nalrith. Oh no. How did Nalrith take it? About as well as you'd expect someone to take the news that their definitive proof of impossibility was definitively wrong. Plixen's eye clusters focused on her. The Council wants to see you. Now. The walk to the High Council chambers felt like a march to execution. Plixen led the way through corridors Lyanna had never accessed before. The fancy sections where the walls actually had art and the lighting didn't flicker. They passed laboratories where beings were working on problems that would make her brain melt. Observation decks that offered views that cost more than her yearly salary just to access. For what it's worth, Plixen said quietly, I think what you've done is remarkable. Truly. Thanks. I think I'm about to be remarkable and unemployed. Perhaps. Or perhaps you're about to change everything. The council chambers were exactly as intimidating as Lyanna had imagined. Circular, with a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time map of known space. The 5 council members sat, or hovered, or stood, depending on their physiology, in an arc. And there, off to one side, was Nalerith. The Quarren's bioluminescent patterns were strobing in what Lyanna's brief cultural training suggested was either rage or extreme agitation. Possibly both. Morphin spoke first, their crystalline voice chiming through the chamber. Mathematician Lyanna, please approach. Lyanna walked to the center of the chamber, acutely aware that she was wearing the same casual jumpsuit she'd worn to breakfast. Everyone else looked official and important. She looked like she'd wandered in from the cafeteria, which, historically speaking, wasn't far from the truth. We have reviewed your submission, Morphin continued. Multiple independent verification teams have confirmed your mathematical framework. The discrete dimensional jumping approach does indeed resolve the dimensional cascade paradox. The chamber was silent, except for Nalrith's patterns flickering like a strobe light. I see, Lyanna managed. Do you understand what you've accomplished? This from Quilnax, the gaseous council member, whose colors shifted to something that might have been awe. I solved an equation? You solved an equation that was declared impossible mere days ago by our leading expert, using an approach that violates fundamental assumptions held across hundreds of civilizations. Quilnax's form pulsed. How? And there it was, the question she'd been dreading. Lyanna glanced at Nalrith, whose patterns had gone very, very still. Then back at the council. I didn't know it was impossible, she said simply. I mean, I knew everyone said it was impossible, but I didn't know, no. So I just tried things. Tried things, Nalrith said, speaking for the first time. Their voice was dangerously quiet. You tried things. Well, yeah. I looked at the assumption about continuous dimensional threading, and it seemed like maybe that was the problem, so I asked myself what would happen if it wasn't continuous. And then I worked through the math. She shrugged. It took maybe 30 minutes? The silence that followed was the kind that made you want to check if everyone's translator had broken simultaneously. 30 minutes, Nalrith repeated. Give or take. I mean, I spent a few more hours writing it up properly, but the core solution came pretty quick once I had the right framework. This problem has consumed 300 cycles of research across the greatest mathematical minds in the galaxy. Right. And that might be part of the issue? Liana's nervous energy was converting into the kind of reckless honesty that had gotten her in trouble her entire life. You all were so focused on proving why it couldn't be solved within the existing framework that nobody stepped outside the framework. You were looking for elegant proofs when maybe you just needed a working solution. Naldrith's patterns flared. The mathematical rigor of proper proof methodology is not some trivial concern to be dismissed. I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying that sometimes when you're stuck, you need to break your own rules. Liana felt her confidence growing. Humans are really good at that. We're not smart enough to know what we're not supposed to do, so we just do things, and sometimes it works. Another pause. Then Morphin made a sound like wind chimes in a storm. Laughter, Liana realized. Remarkable, the crystalline being said. Absolutely remarkable. News traveled fast in the consortium, but news this explosive? It moved at quantum speeds. By the next morning, Liana's solution was the only thing anyone was talking about. The cafeteria buzzed with dozens of languages, all discussing the human who'd casually demolished 3 centuries of mathematical certainty over lunch. Her datapad was flooded with interview requests, collaboration offers, and more than a few messages that could only be described as hate mail from mathematicians whose life's work had just been rendered obsolete. Oren found her hiding in a maintenance alcove on level 23, eating a protein bar and watching repair drones fix a coolant leak. "You're famous," he announced. "I'm hiding." "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He slid down the wall to sit beside her. "They're calling it the human paradigm shift. There's a symposium being organized. 3 universities have already offered you positions. And someone started a conspiracy theory that you're actually a hyper-intelligent AI pretending to be human. That last one's almost flattering. Also, Nalrith has reportedly locked themselves in their laboratory and refuses to speak to anyone." Liana winced. "I didn't mean to humiliate them." "I know. But you kind of did, though. Publicly. Spectacularly. With napkins." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the drones work with mechanical precision. Somewhere in the distance, the station's life support systems hummed their eternal song. "The Council wants me to co-author the official publication with Nalrith," Liana said finally. "They think it'll demonstrate unity and collaboration between species or something." "How does Nalrith feel about that?" "Haven't asked. I'm assuming somewhere between murderous rage and existential despair." "So, standard mathematician response to being wrong?" "Despite everything," Liana laughed. "Pretty much." Her datapad chimed. Another message. She glanced at it and froze. "What?" Oren leaned over to look. The message was from Nalrith. Just 2 words. "My laboratory." "Well," Oren said, "that's either a peace offering or a murder invitation." "Thanks. Super helpful." "Want me to come with? I can stand outside and alert security if I hear screaming." "You're a terrible friend." "The worst." "So is that a yes?" Liana stood, brushing dust off her jumpsuit. "It's a wait here, and if I'm not back in an hour, assume the worst." Nalrith's laboratory was in Section 4EA, the prestigious research wing where only the most accomplished mathematicians worked. The corridors here were pristine, Lined with awards and accolades, Liana felt distinctly out of place in her standard-issue station wear, passing beings in elegant research robes discussing theories she couldn't begin to comprehend. The door to Nalarith's lab was closed. Liana stood outside for a long moment, gathering courage, then pressed the entry chime. Enter. The laboratory was surprisingly chaotic. She'd expected pristine organization, but instead found holographic displays covering every available surface, showing equations in various stages of completion. Physical notation covered actual paper, rare and expensive. Empty containers of what she assumed was quarren nutrition scattered on surfaces. This was the laboratory of someone who'd been working without sleep, without breaks, driven by something beyond mere curiosity. Nalarith stood at the center of it all, patterns dim and subdued. You came, they said. You messaged. I did. Nalarith's tentacles moved in what Liana was learning to recognize as agitation. I have spent the past 3 days attempting to find an error in your work. Any error. The smallest flaw that would invalidate your solution. And there is none. Your mathematics is sound. Unconventional, certainly. Lacking in certain formal rigor, perhaps. But fundamentally, irrefutably correct. They turned to face her fully. Do you understand what you've done to me? Liana chose her words carefully. I solved a problem. You destroyed my legacy, my life's work. I built my reputation on the impossibility of the dimensional cascade paradox. I wrote 17 papers on it. I presented at every major conference. I was the authority. Their patterns flickered. And you solved it in 30 minutes, on napkins, during lunch. I didn't mean... No, let me finish. Nalarith moved, closer. I was angry, furious, humiliated. I wanted to prove you wrong more than I have ever wanted anything in my 6 decades of life. And then, as I worked through your methodology, something unexpected happened. What? I understood. Nalarith's patterns shifted to something softer. You approached the problem without the weight of 300 cycles of assumptions. You saw what we were blind to, because we knew too much. You didn't just solve the dimensional cascade paradox, Liana. You revealed that our approach to dimensional mathematics has been fundamentally limited. They gestured at the displays around them. I've spent the last 2 days applying your discrete jumping framework to other problems. Classical problems we considered solved, but perhaps solved incompletely. And I've found... Their patterns pulsed with something that might have been excitement. I've found errors, gaps, opportunities. Liana felt her pulse quicken. You're saying there are more? I'm saying that your framework opens doors we didn't know existed. Look here. Nalarith pulled up a holographic display. The Vornak's theorem, solved 200 cycles ago. Brilliant work. Foundational to modern hyperspace theory. But when I apply your discrete approach, the equations shifted, reorganized. There's a simpler solution, more efficient, and it suggests applications we never considered. Holy. Indeed. Nalarith's patterns brightened. I have identified at least 4 classical problems that warrant re-examination through your framework. Perhaps more. 4? Perhaps more, Nalarith repeated. Which brings me to why I asked you here. The Council wants us to co-author the official publication on your dimensional cascade solution. I initially found the idea unbearable. But now, they paused. Now I think we should go further. A full collaboration. Your intuitive approach combined with my theoretical rigor. Human creativity paired with quarren precision. Liana stared. You want to work together? I want to revolutionize dimensional mathematics, and I believe, it pains me to admit this, but I believe that you might be the key to doing so." Nalarith extended a tentacle in what she'd learned was a gesture of partnership. "So, will you help me prove that the last 300 cycles of mathematical certainty were merely the beginning?" Liana looked at the tentacle, at Nalarith's hopeful patterns, at the equations dancing in holographic light around them, at the future suddenly spreading out in directions she'd never imagined. She reached out and shook the tentacle. "On one condition. Name it." "The cafeteria gets better coffee. I'm talking real Earth coffee, not whatever synthetic nonsense they're serving now. If I'm going to revolutionize mathematics, I need proper caffeine." Nalarith's patterns flickered in what Liana was absolutely certain was amusement. "I believe that can be arranged." The official publication hit the Galactic networks 3 weeks later, and calling it a sensation would be like calling a supernova a bit bright. The paper, co-authored by Nalarith and Liana, with contributions from Plixon and a verification team spanning 6 species, didn't just present the solution to the dimensional cascade paradox. It outlined an entire framework for what they were calling discontinuous dimensional mathematics, complete with applications that made theoretical physicists across the galaxy start hyperventilating into paper bags, or whatever their species used for managing excitement-induced oxygen problems. The speed at which civilization pivoted was almost comical. Faster-than-light travel companies immediately began retooling their engines based on the new principles. Energy generation facilities started planning upgrades that would triple their output while halving their resource consumption. Academic institutions rewrote entire curricula practically overnight. And Earth? Earth lost its collective mind. Liana's inbox became a wasteland of messages from her home planet. Her mother sent 17 voice recordings, each more tearful than the last. Her old MIT colleagues oscillated between congratulations and thinly veiled jealousy. The global media wanted interviews. Governments wanted consultations. Someone started a religion based on her napkin sketches, which was deeply concerning, but also kind of hilarious. Through it all, Liana and Nalarith worked. The laboratory that had once been Nalarith's exclusive domain became their shared space, a chaotic fusion of Quarren precision and human intuition. Holographic displays mixed with physical paper. Elegant proofs sat beside scribbled shortcuts. The contrast drove visiting mathematicians slightly insane, but the results were undeniable. They'd tackled the Voronak's theorem first, and Nalarith's instinct had been correct. The classical solution, while mathematically sound, had taken the long way around. Liana's discreet approach cut through it like a hot knife through butter, revealing applications in quantum field manipulation that nobody had anticipated. The implications for communications technology alone would reshape interstellar commerce. Problem 2 had been the Kelmir conjecture, a puzzle about multidimensional geometry that had been considered settled science for 150 cycles. Turned out, it wasn't settled at all, just solved in the most complicated way possible. The simplified solution opened up new approaches to artificial gravity generation. Problem 3 was currently making their brains hurt, but they were making progress. And then there was Problem 4. "I found something," Nalarith announced one morning, their patterns pulsing with barely contained excitement. Liana looked up from her coffee. Proper Earth coffee now, shipped in at considerable expense as per her contract negotiation. One of her better life choices. Good something or concerning something? Both. Definitely both. Nalarith pulled up, a display that made Liana's eyes water just looking at it. "You're familiar with the temporal causality barrier? The thing that prevents time travel and keeps the universe from imploding into paradoxes? Vaguely, yes. It's considered the one truly inviolable law. Even the most optimistic physicists accept that backward temporal manipulation is impossible, not just practically difficult, but fundamentally prohibited by the structure of space-time itself. Okay? I've been applying your discrete framework to the underlying mathematics. Nalrith's tentacles moved in agitation. Liana, I think the temporal causality barrier might not be a barrier at all. I think it might be the same kind of assumption we made about dimensional threading, an elegant theory we all accepted without questioning because it worked well enough. The coffee suddenly tasted like ashes. Nalrith, are you telling me we might have accidentally figured out time travel? No, absolutely not. That would be... They paused. Actually, I'm not sure what I'm telling you. The mathematics suggests possibilities I don't fully understand yet. But I wanted you to see this before I showed anyone else, because if I'm right, this changes everything. And if I'm wrong, I'd prefer to be wrong quietly. Liana moved to stand beside them, studying the equations. Her brain struggled to process what she was seeing. But there was something there. A pattern. A possibility. We need to be very, very careful with this, she said finally. Agreed. I propose we table it for now. Focus on problem 3, let this percolate, and revisit when we have more data. Sensible. I'm occasionally capable of sense. Their banter had become comfortable over the weeks. What had started as professional cooperation had evolved into something approaching friendship, though Liana suspected that Nalrith would rather eat their own tentacles than admit it publicly. The door chimed. Plixon entered, mandibles clicking rapidly. You two need to see this. Now. They followed Plixon to the observation deck, where a crowd had gathered around the primary view screen. The display showed a news feed from the Outer Rim territories, where a mining operation had just successfully implemented the first commercial application of discontinuous dimensional mathematics. The results were staggering. Energy efficiency increased by 320%. Travel time between systems cut by 40%. And most remarkably, 0 catastrophic failures, always a concern when implementing revolutionary new technology. They're calling it the Liana-Nalrith principle, Plixon said, antennae twitching with what might have been pride. Shouldn't it be the Nalrith-Liana principle? Someone in the crowd muttered. Alphabetical order and all. Absolutely not, Nalrith said firmly. Liana's insight came first. Her name goes first. The crowd murmured. Liana felt her face flush. More news feeds appeared. A hospital in Chawa, Sector 9 had used the framework to improve their medical imaging, detecting diseases years earlier than previously possible. A research station had managed to study a black hole's event horizon with unprecedented detail. An agricultural world had optimized their weather control systems, potentially ending their drought cycle. The changes rippled outward, exponential and unstoppable. We did that, Liana said quietly. You did that, Nalrith corrected. I merely helped refine it. We did it together. Nalrith's patterns shifted to something warm. Yes, I suppose we did. The formal ceremony happened a month later, in the Grand Assembly Hall where Nalrith had once declared the dimensional cascade paradox unsolvable. The irony was not lost on anyone. Liana stood on the same stage, wearing formal attire that Earth had shipped to her at ridiculous expense. Beside her stood Nalrith, patterns glowing with ceremonial brightness. Plixon was there too, having been promoted to senior research coordinator on the strength of their role in the discovery. The Archimedes chair, the consortium's highest honor, awarded perhaps once every 50 cycles, was being bestowed on Liana. The announcement had caused its own wave of controversy, debates about whether a human who'd been at the station for less than 2 months deserved such recognition. But the High Council had been unanimous. Morphin approached, carrying the traditional token, a crystal matrix that contained the recorded knowledge of every previous chair holder. "Mathematician Liana," the crystalline being intoned, "you are hereby granted the Archimedes Chair in recognition of contributions that have fundamentally altered our understanding of dimensional mathematics and opened pathways to discoveries we have only begun to explore. Your work exemplifies the highest ideals of the consortium: curiosity, rigor, and the courage to challenge established wisdom." The crystal was placed in her hands. It was heavier than she'd expected, and warm. "I have one request," Liana said, her voice carrying through the hall. "Name it," Morphin replied. "Better coffee. Actually, good coffee. For everyone. The cafeteria situation is unacceptable, and if I'm going to be a chairholder, I'm using my influence to fix it." Laughter rippled through the hall. Real laughter this time, not polite dismissal. Even Morphin's crystalline form chimed with amusement. "Granted, though I suspect this may be your most controversial decision." The ceremony continued, but Liana barely heard it. She was thinking about the napkins in her office, the ones she'd saved. About Oren, watching from the audience with an expression of amused pride. About Nullurith beside her, who'd gone from contempt to collaboration in a matter of weeks. About the time-travel mathematics they'd carefully locked away in encrypted files, waiting for the right moment. About the fact that she'd come to this station expecting to spend 2 years being ignored, and instead had accidentally revolutionized galactic civilization before her first month was up. The reception afterward was overwhelming. Dignitaries from dozens of species, all wanting to meet the human who'd solved the impossible. Liana smiled and nodded, and shook appendages, and probably agreed to things she'd regret later. Oren finally rescued her, pulling her aside to a quiet corner. "So," he said, "how does it feel to be the most famous human in the galaxy?" "Exhausting. Surreal. Slightly terrifying." "Fair assessment." He handed her a drink, something purple that fizzed. "What's next?" Liana looked across the hall at Nullurith, who was engaged in animated discussion with a group of quantum theorists. At Plixen, whose mandibles were clicking with excitement as they explained the verification process to a rapt audience. At the view screen showing real-time updates of their framework being implemented across known space. "Honestly? I have no idea. We've got 3 more classical problems to tackle. Nullurith thinks there might be a dozen more after that. And there's this time travel thing we're sitting on that could either be nothing or could be the biggest discovery in the history of physics." "So, just another lunch break for you?" "Pretty much," she grinned. "Though I'm demanding better sandwiches, too. If I'm solving impossible problems on my lunch break, I deserve decent food." "Reasonable." They stood there, watching the celebration, watching the future unfold in real time. Somewhere in Sector 9, a ship was jumping through space using mathematics that hadn't existed 2 months ago. Somewhere else, a child was learning about the Liana-Nullurith principle in school, never knowing it had been scribbled on napkins between bites of terrible cafeteria food. The universe kept expanding, kept moving, kept presenting impossible problems. And somewhere on a space station orbiting a neutron star, a human mathematician and a Quarren theorist were already working on the next one. Because that's the thing about impossible problems, Liana had learned. They're only impossible until someone doesn't know enough to realize they can't solve them. Or until someone cares more about finding answers than preserving assumptions. Or until someone gets really, really tired of everyone saying something can't be done and decides to do it anyway, just to see what happens. Nalrith approached, patterns glowing softly. Ready to return to the laboratory? I have new ideas about problem 3. It's your celebration, too. Shouldn't you enjoy it? I am enjoying it, but I'd enjoy solving problem 3 more. Liana laughed. You know what? Same. They left the reception together, 2 mathematicians who'd accidentally changed the galaxy before lunch, heading back to their chaotic laboratory to see what other impossible things they could make possible. Behind them, the celebration continued. Above them, the neutron star spun, and ahead of them, the universe waited with all its beautiful, impossible questions, just waiting for someone curious enough, stubborn enough, or, in Liana's case, just oblivious enough to the word impossible to find the answers. The cafeteria did get better coffee, by the way, and better sandwiches. Small victories matter. But the time travel thing? That's a story for another lunch break.